Earlier today, the website WikiLeaks released nearly 400,000 classified military documents on the Iraq War. They reportedly revealed details concerning thousands of previously unreported civilian deaths and torture against detainees by Iraqi authorities. Its founder was among a panel who spoke at a news conference in London to talk about his group's findings. This is an hour and 15 minutes.
For investigative journalism at City University, and I'll be attempting to moderate this morning. The press conference, as you know, is dedicated to the release of the Iraq War, and these releases are based on 4 that were received and published by WikiLeaks. You will have seen the print, of course, and television coverage this morning. Those speaking this morning are Julian Assange, the editor of WikiLeaks, which he founded in 2006. WikiLeaks has won a number of awards, including the Index on Censorship's 2008 Economist New Media Award, and an award of distinction from the Prix Arts Electronica. In June 2009, WikiLeaks and Julian Assange won Amnesty International's UK Media Award, and in July this year, he won the Sam Adams Award for Integrity. He's joined by Kristen Hofnason, who became actively involved with WikiLeaks on the Collateral Murder video earlier this year, and has traveled to Baghdad on a fact-finding mission. He has 20 years' experience as an investigative journalist with Channel 2 News, which is a private broadcaster, and RUV, the Icelandic public state broadcaster. He's been awarded twice Iceland's highest journalism award. After WikiLeaks on the panel is John Sloboda. Since 2003, John has been coordinator of the Iraq Body Count Project, an ongoing human security project maintaining and updating the world's largest public database of violent civilian deaths since the 2003 invasion. He's a consultant and director of the Oxford Research Group's Recording Casualties in Armed Conflict program and chairs the International Advisory Group. He is emeritus professor of psychology at the University of Kiel and an honorary professor at the School of Politics and International Relations at Royal Holloway, University of London. The Iraq body count data, I should mention, has been used by an extraordinary group of people: the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Associated Press, Al Jazeera, Open Democracy, The Independent, The Guardian, the World Health Organization, the International Criminal Court, the New England Journal of Medicine, and the European Union's Joint Research Center and the Brookings Institute in Washington. And at 10:25, we'll also be hearing from Phil Shiner. Phil Shiner leads the team at Public Interest Lawyers. He's been practicing as a solicitor in the UK since 1981 and has written extensively on international and human rights law. In recent years, he has acted in some of the most important judicial review cases to be brought in his area of expertise, and in March 2010, he led the team to success in the European Court of Human Rights in a particularly important case. He was made a Solicitor of the Year, by the way, in 2008, and was in the Sunday Times top 10 solicitors in Britain in the same year. So I think we can now start with Julian Assange.
Thank you, Gavin. Because we don't have much time, I won't speak for long. But this disclosure is about the truth. Philip Knightley, the great investigative reporter and Australian who for the past 30 or 40 years has made the UK his home, said that the first casualty of war is the truth. But the attack on the truth by war begins long before war starts and continues long after a war ends. In our release of these 400,000 documents about the Iraq War, the intimate detail of that war from the US perspective, we hope to correct some of that attack on the truth that occurred before the war, during the war, and which has continued on since the war officially concluded. In that material, the deaths of some 109,000 people are documented. Internally declared 66,000 civilians, Working with the Iraq body count, we have seen that there are approximately 15,000 never previously documented or known cases of civilians who have been killed by violence in Iraq. That tremendous scale should not make us blind to the small human scale that occurs in this material. In fact, it is the deaths of 1 and 2 people per event that killed the overwhelming number of people in Iraq. Following our release of the Afghan War Diaries, we thought we would try and pull together a broader coalition, not just involving print, but one that had the emotionality and impact of TV, journalism, and extra research from other groups. So we structured a collaboration between The Guardian, Spiegel, New York Times, our 3 previous print partners, and new groups, the Bureau for Investigative Journalism, the Iraq Body Count, whose knowledge of deaths in Iraq is unsurpassed, SVT, the Swedish television, Al Jazeera, Channel 4, BBC Radio, and I'm sure I've missed some others. Yes, Le Monde. That collaboration seems to have worked. And we will see over the next few days what's to be made of it. But so far, we can see a fairly strong response. We have seen, as of 3 a.m. This morning, 1,500 articles according to Google News, and of course, all around the world, we can see the result. We make a promise to our sources, who go through incredible risks sometimes to get us material, that we will do justice to their efforts and get them the maximum political impact possible. And while I'm not sure that we have achieved the maximum possible, I think we're getting pretty close. And with that, I'll introduce you now to Kristen.
Thank you. When WikiLeaks announced the release of the Afghan War Diary on July 26th, the organization was condemned by the Pentagon for releasing material that was described as sensitive and harmful both to Afghanis and the troops in the country. Those overblown statements were echoed in most of the media without any criticism or critical question. 3 months have passed now, and there have been no reports of any harm in relation to the release of the Afghan War Diary. This has even been acknowledged by the Pentagon. Last week, some news organizations obtained a copy of a letter sent by U.S. Secretary of Defense Robert Gates to the head of the Senate Armed Services Committee on August 16th. This was about the same time that Gates and Pentagon spokesperson were sending out strongly worded statements aimed at WikiLeaks. In Gates' letter, however, it is acknowledged that the Afghan documents had not revealed any, quote, sensitive intelligence sources or methods, unquote. Last week, a top NATO official reiterated in a statement to the press that he had not seen any harm as a result of the release. The contrast between the letter, the quote by the NATO official, and the hyped statements by the Pentagon spokesperson should be a reminder that people should not accept condemning statements against WikiLeaks without question. In relation to the Afghan files, WikiLeaks withheld 1 in 6 reports, 15,000 in all, for line-by-line reviewing and redaction. That work is now finished, and the reports will be released soon. This time, WikiLeaks took a new approach to the redacting process. It used an electronic redaction method combined with tests done by groups of people. It is an innovative approach and has been perfected by a group of people contributing to the process. It can best be described as a reverse approach to redaction. At the outset, everything in all reports was deemed harmful and redacted until proven otherwise. From there on, words, phrases, locations, abbreviations, etc., were uncovered or unredacted step by step. The work in the passing weeks have therefore been focusing on minimizing the redaction. Along the way, batches of documents were taken out and tested by a group of qualified volunteers, and further tests were done on the 390,000 documents. We are confident now that the documents in the highly redacted form contain no information that could be harmful to individuals. Having said that, I would like to add that every system can contain flaws, but the likelihood of any flaw in our approach is surely minimal. The end result which we are presenting is still in a highly redacted cache of documents. Despite the over-reductions, the war log is easily readable and can be data mined for news stories and angles for those interested. We will also look into the possibility of providing news media and academics access to unredacted parts of the documents upon request. Furthermore, it needs to be emphasized that we aim to continue on the track of further minimizing the reductions, but being a small organization with limited resources, this could take some time.
Thanks, Kristen. You'll see on warlogs.wikileaks.org the interface that Kristen spoke of. That permits full text searching of the entire redacted collection, including sort of Boolean terms. You can search for keywords like OGA, other government agency, a euphemism typically for the CIA or DIA. We also partnered with OGMI to produce a system where people who have information about these events can comment on them and rate them. Go to the website and have a look at that. There's a lot of, obviously there's a tremendous worldwide interest at the moment, so those systems may be slow, but if you persevere across the day, you will find them to be quite usable. It's what we use partially internally, and the Iraq body count also has a system which they'll describe.
John? In any human disaster, finding out who died and how they died is the overriding public concern. But 7 years on, the public does not have a full account of the terrible human cost of this ongoing Iraq war to the Iraqi people. What we have instead is an incomplete patchwork of stories, pictures, and data gathered by different organizations for different purposes, often published one day and forgotten the next. The victims of this war, their families, and the publics whose taxes funded this war deserve better than this. There is a public right to know. Iraq Body Count has been working on a daily basis since March 2003 to ensure that no fact about a civilian death that is uncovered is then lost from view. We carefully monitor, compare, and analyze published reports, mostly provided by press and media organizations, such as are represented in this room. In this way, we have been able to build and keep in the public eye the most detailed and comprehensive list of civilian deaths to date that exists. In fact, the world's press and media have, by default, been the frontline data gatherers of this war. Without journalists and without the organizations for which they work, the world would know little of substance about the Iraq death toll. But yesterday's release reveals that there has been another frontline data gatherer, the US Army. Day by day, secretly, soldiers all over Iraq have been writing detailed reports of the violent deaths they cause, witness, or are informed about. Dates, times, precise locations, names, ages, and occupations of victims have all been stored away in these logs. It is very good that this data has been collected, but it is wrong and unjustifiable that it has been kept secret for so long. Iraq Body Count has started the huge task of integrating the new information into the existing patchwork, just as we would for any other source brought to our attention. In the few weeks since we've had access to the logs, we've only scratched the surface. But by careful sampling and matching of these logs against what is already in our database, we have a clear, emerging picture of what these logs contain as a whole. And the reports on our website, iraqbodycount.org, give the full details. But let me take you through the headline findings. I and my colleagues, Hamit Dardagan, Josh Doherty, and Peter Bagnall, will be available to answer further detailed questions during and after this press conference. Based on our careful sampling, we estimate that when fully analysed, these logs will bring to public knowledge more than 15,000 previously unreported civilian deaths, to add to the 107,000 which are already in the Iraq Body Count database. 15,000 is a huge number. It's equivalent to 5 9/11s or nearly 300 7/7s. However, the newly revealed deaths do not primarily come from large bombings like this. Most of the larger incidents were already well reported by the world's press and media. The new deaths are concentrated in small incidents, killing 1 or 2 people at a time, scattered all over Iraq and occurring almost every day for the whole period. Targeted assassinations, drive-by shootings, executions, checkpoint killings. These are the small but relentless tragedies of this war that these logs reveal in unprecedented detail. Adding in the combatant deaths reported in these logs and combining with other previously reported deaths, we are now able to say that more than 150,000 people have been killed in total since 2003, of which about 80% were civilians. Even where deaths were previously known about as numbers, these logs often turn numbers into human beings. For instance, the IBC database records that on November the 1st, 2006, 35 bodies were found around Baghdad that day, as reported, for example, by Reuters, the New York Times, CNN, among others. However, media reports did not identify any of the victims, nor give details of how each one died. So our IBC database has just this spare information in it. The Iraq war logs also report 35 bodies found that day, but spread across 27 logs, specifying a wide range of details, including the precise neighbourhood and time of day where particular bodies were found, and in many cases, the demographics and identities of those killed. So when fully processed, the information in these logs will allow our single entry to be replaced by over 20 detailed incidents. Most surprisingly of all, we have found a huge number of names of victims meticulously recorded in these logs. It's unclear to us why the US Army wanted to go to such lengths in its recording, but it is of huge public importance and interest that it did. Names are the gold dust of casualty recording enterprise, and the only certain route to a full and final death toll that will satisfy all parties, including bereaved families. We've already found over 100 previously reported civilian victim names in the logs we've examined, and we estimate that many thousands more will be discovered as analysis proceeds. For instance, on 29th of November 2006, 28 bodies were discovered in a mass grave south of Baqaba. This was comprehensively reported by press and media at the time, but not a single one of those reports gave the names of a single victim. The Iraq war logs list all these names one by one, and so today, for the first time, they have been put into the public record, nearly 4 years later. The unprecedented level of detail in these logs is important for another reason too. It's the main way in which we can properly assess what is new in them. The crude death totals that these logs provide are lower than the comparable count from IBC, also lower than figures from others providing totals, such as the Iraq Ministry for Human Rights. This can tempt people to mistakenly assert that there is nothing new in these logs. Our analysis shows how hugely mistaken that assertion is. In conclusion, we believe that having received these logs, WikiLeaks was right to publish them in this heavily redacted form. But the real story is not about the release itself, but the grave content of the logs themselves. Almost every log tells a story, and far too often This is a previously unknown story of human suffering and death. It will take many months, even years, to extract every important fact from these logs. Iraq Body Count is committed to playing its part in this fact-finding work, no matter how long it takes. Because there can be no closure or moving on from this or any war until every last victim has been properly recognized and the full details of the circumstances of their death acknowledged. These logs are potentially the largest single contribution to achieving that goal that has ever been published. We ask everyone, including the US government, to support this work, which is in the public interest and brings closer the proper recognition that all the victims of this tragic war deserve.
Phil Shannon.
The question you're probably asking is, well, what now? And I'm going to tell you about some of the legal action that will follow here in the UK. And it'd be wrong to assume that as these are US logs, this has nothing to do with the UK. Public interest lawyers is presently acting for many Iraqi civilians who've been killed or tortured by UK forces. Some have been killed by indiscriminate attacks on civilians or the unjustified use of lethal force. Others have been killed in custody with UK forces. No one knows how many Iraqis lost their lives whilst held in British detention facilities. The most notable of those, of course, is Baha Musa, and we now await the inquiry's report into his death due in early 2011. The Iraq war logs add hugely to the evidence in the public domain as to the effect of the invasion and subsequent occupation of Iraq by coalition forces, including the UK. What can be said about the logs comes under three headings. All three areas are, or will soon be, the subject of legal action here in the UK. The first is that of unlawful killings of civilians, or indiscriminate attacks upon them, or the unjustified use of lethal force against them. It may never be known how many Iraqis died, but we now know from the important work of Iraq Body Count that the previously known number of deaths, 107,369, is likely to have increased by around a staggering 15,000. Some of these deaths will be in circumstances where the UK had a very clear legal responsibility. This may be because the Iraqis died whilst under the effective control of UK forces, under arrest, in vehicles, helicopters or detention facilities. These deaths will all fall within the jurisdiction of the European Convention on Human Rights if the judgment of the Grand Chamber in the Al-Skyni case, which is due early in 2011, asserts, as we expect, that once UK forces have authority and control over Iraqis, there is jurisdiction for the purposes of the European Convention. But others will not be covered by the European Convention on Human Rights. For example, public interest lawyers has a case where a UK tank stopped and in broad daylight a rifleman aimed, shot and killed an 8-year-old girl playing in her yellow dress in a Basra street. There are many other cases like that, and the logs add to the number of cases that will not be within the jurisdiction of the European Convention. But we will argue in a case shortly that the common law here in the UK provides the same remedy as the European Convention, namely that there must now be a judicial inquiry into the legality of all of these deaths. If unjustified or unlawful force has been used, prosecutions of all those responsible must follow. So we're bringing forward a new case seeking accountability for all unlawful deaths, and we argue that there must be a judicial inquiry to fully investigate UK responsibility for civilian deaths in Iraq. The second area is the huge number of logs that detail horrendous torture and abuse of Iraqis by either the Iraqi National Guard or the Iraqi Police Service. The US and the UK appear to have adopted a fragmented order that required them to take no action whatsoever once they'd established that this torture and ill treatment was the responsibility of Iraqis. Now, this is completely contrary to international law. It's well known that there's an absolute prohibition on torture. It may never be used. Accordingly, all states owe a duty to each other to cooperate together to stamp it out and to deal with incidents of torture so that torturers know beforehand that they will be found out and they will be prosecuted for their war crimes. US and UK forces cannot turn a blind eye on the basis it wasn't their soldiers doing the torturing, and that's what's happened and is revealed in these logs. Both states have the clearest of international obligations to take definite and effective action to stop the torture by the Iraqis. That they did not makes them complicit. Pill is bringing forward a second case seeking accountability for the UK's failure to act in these circumstances. The third area concerns the huge and growing body of evidence about killings, ill treatment and torture of Iraqis whilst in UK custody. There appear to be many cases other than that of Baha Musa where Iraqis died in UK custody and were then certified as dying from natural causes. None of these deaths have been investigated. Many of these Iraqis were hooded and abused, and my law firm does not accept the Ministry of Defence's explanation that each and every one of these deaths has an innocent explanation. Additionally, there are hundreds of Iraqis now complaining of ill treatment and torture, often as a result of coercive interrogation techniques by UK interrogators within secret facilities run by the Joint Forward Interrogation Team. Insofar as the logs add to this body of evidence, they will help us gain a single inquiry into the UK's detention policy and practice in south-east Iraq. A Court of Appeal and High Court judge sitting together will hear a case about all of these incidents on the 5th to the 9th of November 2010.
Thanks very much. We're going to open up very quickly now for questions from the audience, but we have a surprise sort of announcement, an unusual announcement, because we have an unusual addition to the speakers this morning. We have here in the front row probably the most famous whistleblower in modern American history, Daniel Ellsberg, author of the Pentagon Papers, and we'll hear from him shortly. I would request, though, during the questions, that all the questioners to understand that the speakers are pleased to answer any and all questions concerning the release of the documents, the analysis of the data, and conclusions and the work that's been done. But I think I'd like, if I may, just to open the questions by asking Daniel Ellsberg, what's your reaction to this kind of release of material? It's quite different than the one that you did yourself.
Well, it's different and it's the same in many ways, just as the war that we're facing right now, the one in Afghanistan, which I call Vietnamistan, has really more fundamental similarities than it has differences. I've been asked here to make a couple of comments rather than questions to you right away. I'll just say that a couple of us here came over the ocean last night for the opportunity to stand with Julian Assange and the rest of you here in a circumstance that really I've been waiting to see for 40 years. And that's a number is not drawn out of the air. That's a precise figure. Judy Ehrlich, next to me, just co-directed a film called The Most Dangerous Man in America. Well, she's working now on a film, or hopes to do a film, on Julian Assange and his sources. And I haven't talked to her what the title would be, but it seems inevitable, The Most Dangerous Man in the World. Now, how do you get to be the most dangerous man in the world? Well, first, empirically, if one country, our country in this case, is pursuing for prosecution that person, regards him as dangerous over 3 continents at this point, in Australia and Britain and America. The threat that is made by the Pentagon, as we read over the last few days, of warning newsmen to stand away from this material, to refuse to receive it, and if they do receive it, to return it, seems absurd on its face. We're not dealing with the 7,000 pieces of paper, top secret pieces of paper that comprise the Pentagon paper. The Pentagon did make a demand to the New York Times that they return that pile of paper to the Pentagon. The Times refused, and until, in fact, never did return it, and refused to stop the presses until a court order came down. But with cyber material, it's all over the world right now, and in several papers right now, the demand seems absurd. I understand the reason for those words, because they echo the words first used against me the legal words of 18 U.S.C. 793 paragraphs D and E, which for the first time used the so-called Espionage Act as if it were the kind of official secrets act that you have in Britain, which simply criminalizes the release of any classified material to any unauthorized person. We don't have such a law. And the irony now is that President Obama, in making these clear threats of applying this law to anybody who deals with this information, including not only the journalists, but the words apply to the people who read it and don't return it to the proper authorities, actually. President Obama's threats are not entirely without credibility here, because he has started as many prosecutions for leaks as all previous presidents put together. It's a small number. It's 3. The last one is Bradley Manning. It's small because we don't have an official secrets act. And prior to Bush and Obama, presidents took it for granted that any application of the Espionage Act was likely to be overthrown as unconstitutional in our First Amendment by the Supreme Court. But now, facing a different Supreme Court, and after 9/11, Obama is making a new experiment on this issue, which will really change the relation of the press to sources very radically. As it is, any source, with or without this change in the law, who gave this kind of material, 400,000 pages, documents, 800,000 pages, to WikiLeaks, would have to know that they were facing a risk of being where Bradley Manning is right now, in prison, accused of these things. And we don't know, I don't know who the source is. If the president should prove beyond reasonable doubt that it is Bradley Manning, we can give him his unreserved admiration from us and thanks for what he did. But whoever did it, in fact, acted very appropriately in the course of a hopeless, deadly, stalemated war, and which has one characteristic, by the way, in Iraq, which isn't going to come out clearly in these 400,000 pages or in the discussion, and that is that the origins of the war were clearly in the form of lying to the publics of Britain and America, and of carrying on, in the order to carry on a clearly illegal crime against the peace, a war of aggression. So all these civilian casualties are killed in a war of aggression, but one has to say also the non-civilian casualties that are reported here are in the role of fighting against foreign occupiers, invaders, and by the standards of the world, the question is raised very much whether their death by the invader is not also to be counted among the murders until they continue. So I want very much to congratulate all of you who are mining this material to learn what we could have learned if it had come out earlier. Oh, yeah, okay. No, you wanted to do Craig, yeah. Yes, Craig Murray here is representing a group that was mentioned earlier. I didn't know you were here. Mentioned earlier, giving the Sam Adams Award for Intelligence Integrity, and we want very much to appreciate him in that guise.
Thank you. I'm here as a former recipient of the Sam Adams Award for Intelligence, for Integrity and Intelligence. My name's Craig Murray. I was British ambassador in Uzbekistan before I made a series of leaks about UK intelligence sources' use of torture. This award has been given to a number of people, including last to Colonel Larry Wilkinson in the UK, to Major Frank Greville, to Catherine Gunn of GCHQ. It's given to people who, in the public interest, leak details of the dark things that governments do. And I'm very happy to present this year's award to Julian Assange.
I think we'll take questions now from the floor. Right down there. Go ahead.
Neil Chandler from the Daily Star Sunday. I'd just like to ask Phil Shiner.
You mentioned a forthcoming case involving deaths and torturing of Iraqi civilians in British detention. How many deaths are you talking about? Further, you mentioned the young girl getting shot by a squaddy in a tank. Could you give us any more details on that? Where and when did that happen?
I'll do my best on both questions. On the 20th of May 2003, Lieutenant Colonel Nicholas Mercer, a UK Army officer who was head of Army Legal, wrote an order that says chillingly to all the troops who were there, there have recently been a number of deaths of Iraqi civilians in custody with various units. Now, the MOD have lied ever since. When Panorama tried to find out what did Mercer mean by a number, they said 2. It's not 2. It's probably 7 or 8, and it may be more. But that was the 20th of May, 2003. The ongoing disclosure in the Bahamut inquiry keeps turning up more and more and more cases where the Royal Military Police have investigated deaths where there's a common pattern. Often these men are arrested and subjected to severe abuse on arrest in their homes. Sometimes women and children are abused, and sometimes pregnant women have given miscarriages, etc. Then these men are abused, rifle-butted, hooded, sometimes with 2 hoods, in the extreme conditions, and unsurprisingly, they die. And every time they die, it's said that they've died of a heart attack or natural causes. They've never been seen by a UK doctor. Usually somebody has accepted somebody else's word or something that's been written down on a piece of paper. So I can't tell you how many Iraqis we killed whilst we held them in UK detention facilities. You'll have to ask the Ministry of Defence that question. As for the small girl, it was habit for her and her young friends to play in the street, and often UK tanks would stop and would get out, and trying to win the battle for hearts and minds, they would give the children sweets. On the particular morning in question, for some unknown reason that's never been explained, so I can't tell you, the tank stops at the end of the street. She's there in her yellow dress. A rifleman pops up and blows her away. And you'll have to ask the Ministry of Defence why that happened, because they won't tell me. And that's one of the reasons and one of the cases why we are calling for judicial inquiry into all of these deaths.
Back there. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Deborah Haynes for The Times. This is a question for Julian. The Pentagon spokesman said last night that the names of 300 Iraqis have been released as part of the Iraq war logs, and their lives could now be in danger. Are you worried that the careful vetting that you outlined this morning maybe wasn't careful enough and people's lives have been put at risk?
No, I'm worried that the press chooses to credibly report statements like that from the Pentagon. In fact, the Pentagon would not have been able to review our material in those few hours. It is simply logistically impossible. And we also have strong confidence in our redaction process, which is an opt-in process. So that statement by the Pentagon presumably at its base is referring to their own internal review of their collection of significant actions for Iraq. It is not referring to our material, but you'll notice that they do not say that fact. Instead, they try and issue some deceptive statement to fool the world press, as they did last time with some similar statements, into reporting something that is not true.
Yeah, go
ahead. Paul Harrison from Sky News. Julian, you said in your opening statement that you make a promise to all your sources that you will, in quotes, do them justice to for all their efforts. But given that we've seen a very much a shrugging shoulders attitude or a turning a blind eye from the Americans thus far, according to these documents. Will that not continue, and therefore the efforts of your sources may well largely be in vain, or have you had positive noises from the US already?
Well, it's an interesting question as to how responsive government is to the condemnation of its people and the rights of other people. But the shrugging of shoulders is, of course, the second arm of powerful people. The first arm is silence. So we've gotten beyond silence, and now we see an attempt to act in a nonchalant manner about something that is very serious. That does not mean that it is not treated seriously. Rather, there is, or at least was, certainly early on with the Afghan material, an attempt to make it look like it would not be treated seriously, to frame the material as if it was of no consequence. I highly recommend a Daily Show episode which collected all those "there's nothing new in this material" reports for Afghanistan. And as it has turned out, of course, that is not true. In fact, according to Pew Research, total war reportage in the United States for that week increased 300% from 6% to 18%. The approval rating for the Afghan war decreased approximately 15%, and Barack Obama's personal rating, depending on which poll you read, decreased somewhere between 4 and 8%. So those are only, of course, crude figures that speak about the whole rather than individual cases, but we can see continual reportage from far away, high-quality reportage in the past 2 weeks from Norway and Espresso in Italy based upon that Afghan material. A number of parliamentary inquiries. I will be speaking at the UN early next month in relation to the Afghan material. So I expect the same thing to happen for this material for Iraq, and maybe even more. We're talking about 5 times the number of deaths in the same period. We've also put together, I think, a much stronger coalition, a much broader coalition at this time, involving not just print organisations, but human rights groups and lawyers and so on. So I think we're going to see some concrete effects, if not just the perceptual effects about how wars are conducted. An interesting note is that when I made the opening about the truth being the first casualty of war, we actually see that most wars that are started by democracies involve lying. Vietnam War and the Gulf of Tonkin incident involved lying. The start of the Iraq War involved very serious lies, which were repeated and amplified by some parts of the press. Which leads us to say what? Not that isn't the world terrible because there's a lot of lying by officials, but rather it leads us to a great hope that democracies don't start wars unless there's lies. So if there's enough truth early on enough, then perhaps we won't see these kind of wars.
Over there, in white shirt.
Hi, so, hi, question for Julian. Ed Caesar from the Sunday Times. There's been some suggestions in the hacking community that the systems that WikiLeaks uses don't offer sources the full protection that you advertise on the site. Can you comment on that?
There is a lot of tabloid press surrounding our organisation, and of course every organisation that has a high profile and is involved in controversial activities. I have seen no reports that are credible.
No, not down here? Yeah. Yourself.
Yeah, I'm from ITN. Can I just ask you a very general question? From your reading of all the reports that you've gathered, how would you characterize the conditions that existed in Iraq in the time period that you're reporting on?
Well, I think John is probably the best place to answer.
Could you
that
answer it
material.
yourself first? I'm sorry, would you mind?
You prefer the more ignorant opinion, but I'll let John answer first, and if he misses something, then I'll comment.
Our focus is entirely on the victims and those who died. So what we can see, but it is simply a finer, detailed picture of what was actually already very well known by the world at large and press and media, is this relentless grind of daily killings, day by day, in almost every town, every province in Iraq, of checkpoint killings, drive-by shootings, with no end. And the effect that must have on the ordinary Iraqi people is just uncalculable. In regard to the other kinds of information in the logs, torture and other observations, we have nothing to say at this point.
Christian?
No? Okay. Next question, right here. Right here.
I'll direct this question at Phil. On the importance of the government granting a full judicial investigation, if that doesn't happen, will they take each case on an individual basis and string this out for a decade and more, therefore lessening the impact of it? So the government coming round and granting that judicial review is crucial to your process, isn't it?
It is. The government's position is that it can deal with one case at a time, and each case will take a year. We have 142 outstanding cases, so that will take 142 years. The alternative is for the administrative court here in London to put teams of judges into courtrooms to deal with these cases within a proper timescale. Both of those, we say, are absurd, and that the only rational solution to all of these cases is to get it over with and hold a proper inquiry along the lines of the Baha Musa inquiry, which has just concluded. And the MOD really need to stop covering up, which they do with greater and greater desperation, slurring everyone that they possibly can. We all know that many things went badly wrong in Iraq. We know from the Baha Musa inquiry, for instance, that we should have had a detailed interrogation directive in force in Iraq. That directive would have told interrogators what they could, and more importantly, what they could not do. The MOD in the Baha Musa inquiry say, we're very sorry we didn't have one. And we're very sorry also that that meant that the interrogators fell back on training techniques from Chicksands. And we're also very sorry to admit that the training was completely unlawful. It involved forced nudity, keeping people naked if they wouldn't cooperate, harshing, invasion of intimate space, the use of threats. One man said to the Baha Musa inquiry, the only limits on coercion were the limits of one's imagination. And I'm not going to try and explain the horrendous things that people did to my clients when they let their imagination run wild. A lot of it involves paedophilic images, hardcore pornography, sexual intercourse and sexual acts in front of my clients, etc., etc., etc. You simply cannot say that this is all down to a few bad apples, a few rogue soldiers, a few isolated incidents. It's horrendous, it's been covered up, and you, the press, are often the people who allow it to be covered up because you simply don't run the stories. You're obsessed, some of you, with what we might have done in Pakistan or what we might have known in Guantanamo Bay. I say to you, wake up and have a look at what's happening in our High Court next month on November the 5th about what we actually did. We intend to open that inquiry and reveal material which no one has yet seen about the way in which we interrogated people. I invite you to turn up in force in the High Court on November the 5th and find out what the UK actually did and stop going on about what we might have done or what we might have known about what the US were doing. Because I can tell you a comparison of what we did, which emerges from all this evidence, which I have to say none of my clients ever have been found to be embellishing the truth, let alone lying. They've all been found to be telling the truth. So I invite you to come along and find out what we actually did. And just for 1 month, stop going on about what we might have been complicit in.
Okay, back there, in the back.
Mark Roche of Le Monde. Don't you have, unlike Afghanistan, that on Iraq, the public opinion has turned the page? We have been lied on, but life goes on. There are economic problems at the moment, and that there isn't the interest for Iraq that there was on Afghanistan this summer.
To whom are you directing the question?
Well, for Afghanistan, we had 14 pages of The Guardian. For Iraq, we have 9. And I suspect that's probably a proportionate view in the United Kingdom's press about the relative importance. But Iraq is now just cool enough, although remember there's still 50,000 US troops there and something like 150,000, 100,000 contractors. Iraq is now cool enough, at least in the public imagination, to properly take a look at it. And that's not something that is yet possible with Afghanistan. We did a little bit of that with the Afghan War Log release because it was a primary source documentation, but otherwise views about patriotism and the supporting of troops and so on interferes with the process. For Iraq, I can see already in the news reportage a much fairer and less defensive portrayal of what happened in Iraq that has been revealed by this release. So these two countries do not stand in isolation. These are both modern Western wars. And the lessons of Iraq, which are ongoing, remember this material covers significant abuses occurring during the first year of the Obama administration, can be applied to Afghanistan and can be applied to other places that Western governments may choose in isolation or in coalition to invade. The war itself in the United States, I think, is becoming more of an issue. The Republicans are using the mismanagement of the Afghan war against the Democrats. We're 1 week before the congressional elections. And the Democrats can point to, rightly, the terrible abuses that occurred under a Republican administration. I hope that will permit raising of this issue. But I think in the last 24 hours, the press has been doing precisely what they should. And there's a good and broad spectrum. And you know, the press, when it concentrates on a press issue, can overplay things. But I think their response to this issue has been broad and proportionate and will continue.
Okay. Back over there behind.
Yeah, Anthony Fiola with the Washington Post. Can you detail the additional steps that you took between the release of the Afghan documents and these documents in terms of redaction, and to make sure that names, etc., were not released?
Well, I think that Kristen covered that pretty well, but to make it simple, because it's a fairly long and complex technical process, which I can speak about later to some of you, but not so we don't bore the room. The fundamental principle was to start with everything, every single word and number redacted, and then to wind that back by finding safe words and then modifying the safe words and phrases for the rare accounts where there were dual meanings of words. And that process also involved some of the investigative journalists and researchers consulting with us to give us a feel for what sort of information needed a special care. Although I must say, in that process, the human rights groups were very helpful, and the Bureau of Investigative Journalism was also helpful, but none of the mainstream press partners, in fact, provided any assistance whatsoever to the demands to get 400,000 very serious documents into the public record and into history where they can have ongoing effect. Oh, and if I may add, the Pentagon, of course, refused. Its statement was, we are not interested in a conversation about harm minimization. We are only wanting to hear how the documents will be returned, and the legal counsel for the DoD also issued that statement to us in private correspondence.
Yeah. Right back there. Go ahead.
Enrico Franceschini from La Repubblica, Italy. Julian, sometimes you're portrayed like a man on the run. Are you worried about your safety? Do you think that your enemies are trying to hurt you, to get you?
Well, I think that question's been answered a lot in the past. I mean, if you have anything you want to say to it, but.
Well, I mean, I can only sort of get people to consider the words of Daniel Ellsberg, that we have a serious case here where the Obama administration is trying to create new law through changing the interpretation of existing law. In a similar manner to, I suppose, the way in which Bush expanded the power of the presidency using lawyers to create new interpretations of previous arrangements. And that is a serious business. That applies not just to me, but the statements made by the Pentagon are trying to be applied to all press in the United States and outside the United States.
Yeah, right down there in the front. This structure.
Dan Myggen from Computer World. Wednesday, you wrote on your Twitter feed that WikiLeaks communications infrastructure was under attack. Do you have any evidence, log files, IP addresses, which could help pinpoint who is making these attacks? And can you elaborate a bit more what this attack was about?
That matter is still being investigated, and I think is perhaps too far removed from the subject of this conference.
Okay, in the very back, blue.
Julian, back in summer, I had the feeling you said, you wanted the truth to come out, which you still want to, but I have the feeling now that where you said, a lot of wars are started by democracies. You hope that this procedure might stop that happening in the future. So has your aim broadened altogether?
No, we are pursuing the agenda that we have always pursued.
In the red, down there. Hold on, a microphone's coming
Okay.
to you there. Okay, go ahead.
Hi, Anne McMillan, Canadian Broadcasting. You mentioned that you hope the lessons will be learnt from Iraq. What would you say are the main lessons that have come through these 400,000 leaked documents?
Well, it's too early to tell yet. It is the responsibility of the press and the opportunity of the press and human rights groups and legal outfits to, in fact, draw those conclusions. But, I mean, Iraq, as we can see, was a bloodbath on every corner of that country. The stated aims for going into that war of improving the rule of law did not eventuate, and in terms of raw numbers of people arbitrarily killed, worsened the situation in Iraq.
Yep, right down the front there. Go ahead. Is there a microphone? Right over here. Thanks.
Till Krause from Süddeutsche Zeitung magazine from Munich, Germany. In your press release, you stated that it gives the current leak gives a pretty good account of the war in Iraq without the month May 2004 and March 2009. Why?
We don't know why those months are missing. It's important to remember that this material, while the most comprehensive and detailed report of any war to ever have entered into the public record, is far from complete. It is based upon the statements of US soldiers who are often in a position where they have incentives to lie, such as when they're reporting on their own activities. No one says, I unlawfully killed a civilian, and the right to report about it. It is only material that is of the secret level or below. Events which were subsequently classified as top secret are not present. It doesn't cover US special forces, it doesn't cover the CIA, it doesn't cover the military activities of any other nation in the coalition partnership or the activities of the Iraqi army, except where the regular United States Army interfaces with them. So sometimes the regular US Army will pull security for the CIA, engage in combined operations with the Iraqi army, with US Special Forces, with UK forces. So we get small glimpses through a corner of a window for those organizations involved in the Iraq, which are not the US Army proper. So we do glimpse their activities, but this is not a full account of their activities. It is a pretty full account of the activities of the US Army.
We've got time for one further question. I'll actually pass it over to you, right here. Go ahead. You had your hand up the longest.
Thanks. Mary Mata, Voice of America. This is a question I'm asking anyone on the panel about we, the press. Why do you think it's easier for us to cover things like rape as a tool of war in places like West Africa and other places around the world where it's been widely documented, as opposed to some place like Iraq?
One of the things that we have to face up to, and we see it very clearly in the Bahamas inquiry, is a historic British colonial savagery, if I can put it like that. The techniques that we were using in the Musa incident, hooding, stress positions, food and water deprivation, sleep deprivation, the use of noise. Those all go all the way back to mandated Palestine, through all the colonial wars, Cyprus, Malaya, Aden, Kenya, and into Northern Ireland. And you might think that when Ted Heath banned it in 1972, it stayed banned. No, not at all. If you look at what the British did in Iraq, it's a savagery. These Iraqi men simply did not exist. They had been completely dehumanised. Now, my take is one of the reasons the press are largely silent on all of this is we just don't want to face ourselves. That's my take on the British position and what we did in Iraq. You'd have to ask the Americans for their take. But I think it's important that there's a horrendous racism, and we see it in the British Army, we see it very clearly in the Bahamas inquiry, and I think we can see it very clearly in everything that is going to come out when we get this case heard next month. And again, I invite the British press particularly to pay attention to this case. It's important.
Okay, we actually have 1 or 2 more minutes left. There was a hand over here. Okay, go ahead.
Secrecy is essential to empire, and what I was saying earlier was the United States right now, no doubt is declining in various ways, but not in intention. And under Obama, as under Bush, we are moving more toward the British system of control of information, which is, after all, the Official Secrets Act, which is a legacy of empire, and that torch is passing. The Republican administration, a Republican House and Senate, if that comes into being in the next month, is almost certain to pass a British-type Official Secrets Act, essentially ending leaks of the sort we've seen over the last 40 years, 60 years, which means that WikiLeaks becomes more indispensable than it has been. It becomes the future of unauthorized disclosure. It'll become more and more important to make these disclosures anonymously. And what has to be disclosed? As Julian was saying, honestly, WikiLeaks is not sufficient. What we've seen so far is not what we need. It's only a beginning. It's not the Pentagon Papers, strictly speaking. We still need the Pentagon Papers of Afghanistan and of Iraq on the decision-making and the accountability. But for that matter, the Pentagon Papers were very inadequate too. They weren't the White House papers, the CIA papers. It took us a generation to get most of those, and we haven't had any of it really on the later wars since. So what we need is, the closest to it in a way, are the classified documents that were shown to Bob Woodward for his latest book. So possibly Woodward could contribute to the net all the documents he was shown, top secret. That would come close to being the Pentagon Papers or the White House Papers of Afghanistan, would be very worthwhile. Short of that, one of his researchers could give those documents to WikiLeaks, and that would be very worthwhile. And if not one of his researchers, somebody in the administration should give that type of material to WikiLeaks. Bradley Manning is accused of doing what he could at the field level, at the risk of his life, very admirably. He's a hero, in my opinion, to end this war. He did what he could. What's needed is for people who have access to information that will help us understand this war in a way that will enable us to stop it, to show us what they know with documents, and actually WikiLeaks offers itself as the best vehicle for their doing that.
Okay, thank you. I think, in fact, what we're going to do now is not run a photo call, which was booked here for simple reasons of time now, because it's gone over quite considerably. But we have a short film produced by WikiLeaks to help to explain some of the technical issues involved in reading the documents. It's a very short film, but might be helpful to you because it comes from a knowledge of those documents directly. It should be up. You've canceled it. Yeah. Oh. So, okay, well, you're not going to see it then.
This is how to read the data.
That's the one.
Yep.
That's the one.
So that's just the slides. Are we still doing that?
We still have this film, don't we?
Slides. Ingy.
The film or not? Sarah?
Do we have the slides? Okay, let's go.
Let's do it. Yeah, okay. Sorry, it's going to happen. Sorry.
So, because we are so incredibly overloaded presently, you might not have actually seen this yet, but this is it, warlogs.wikileaks.org. This is a souped up version of what we use for... This is a souped up... This is warlogs.wikileaks.org. It is the interface to explore and analyze these 400,000 classified documents about the war in Iraq. It is a similar interface to what we produced subsequent to our initial release for Afghanistan, but a bit more sophisticated and able to handle many tens of thousands of people simultaneously. So this is the website. You can see automatic graphing of particular elements. You can search by keyword. Here's an example of selecting one of the categories on the side that is produced by the US military. These are types, regions, attacks on type of units, and several other categories that are not produced by us, but they're the internal military categories. By clicking on these, you will see them appear here. These are Boolean, so this is an and. The records must have both of these. Type, criminal event, region, Baghdad. This is multinational division Baghdad. And this is a list of reports with sort of keywords in context. The underscores are redaction. And this is looking a bit further down on the side panel here. So you can see graphs and the number of documents for each one of the numerical fields. So civilians killed, date, host nation killed, host nation wounded, friendly killed, etc. Quite a few of these, very easy to use. Here's an example of going into a particular record. So bodies found in a car in the vicinity of Baghdad. You click on here, expand acronyms, very important, otherwise this is almost completely unreadable. And here it is in red, the things that are expanded in acronyms. Killed in action would have been KIA, died of wounds, DOW. And on the left, the structured data concerning this event. And we'll go down a bit. This one's quite interesting here. It's not often used, but this is critical incident reporting. It sometimes will include a field which is may cause international media reportage. So actually, if you want international media, something to report, you just hunt on this field and they've done part of the work for you in some cases. Obviously, some units where they are involved themselves in a crime don't like to suggest that they have done so through the use of this field. This is a slightly more interesting one, a full-text search for OGA. Sometimes appears here as a type of unit. OGA stands for Other Government Agency. It's an internal euphemism for the CIA or the Defense Intelligence Agency, typically the CIA. And so you can find these CIA-related records, small arms fire attack on OGA convoy in Baghdad. Expanding acronyms here, you can see this. Fortunately, the redaction is, in fact, far too heavy, but was necessary to prevent any sort of political attack to distract from the real issue. As time goes by and we work through this material manually, we will be able to decrease the levels of redaction. But in this report, not too bad. It's mainly the names and some specific locations.
Okay, fine.
Yep. That's it? Okay, we're done.
Thank you.
Still to come on
School of Politics and International Relations at Royal Holloway, University of London. The Iraq body count data, I should mention, has been used by an extraordinary group of people. The New York Times, the Washington Post, the Associated Press, Al Jazeera, Open Democracy, The Independent, The Guardian, the World Health Organization, the International Criminal Court, the New England Journal of Medicine, and the European Union's Joint Research Center and the Brookings Institute in Washington. And at 10:25, we'll also be hearing from Phil Shiner. Phil Shiner leads the team at Public Interest Lawyers. He's been practicing as a solicitor in the UK since 1981 and has written extensively on international and human rights law. In recent years, he has acted in some of the most important judicial review cases to be brought in his area of expertise, and in March 2010, he led the team to success in the European Court of Human Rights in a particularly important case. He was made a Solicitor of the Year, by the way, in 2008, and was in the Sunday Times top 10 solicitors in Britain in the same year. So I think we can now start with Julian Assange.
Thank you, Gavin. Because we don't have much time, I won't speak for long. But this disclosure is about the truth. Philip Knightley, the great investigative reporter and Australian who for the past 30 or 40 years has made the UK his home, said that the first casualty of war is the truth. But the attack on the truth by war begins long before war starts and continues long after a war ends. In our release of these 400,000 documents about the Iraq War, the intimate detail of that war from the US perspective, we hope to correct some of that attack on the truth that occurred before the war, during the war, and which has continued on since the war officially concluded. In that material, the deaths of some 109,000 people are documented. Internally declared, 66,000 civilians. Working with the Iraq body count, we have seen that there are approximately 15,000 never previously documented or known cases of civilians who have been killed by violence in Iraq. That tremendous scale should not make us blind to the small human scale that occurs in this material. In fact, it is the deaths of 1 and 2 people per event that killed the overwhelming number of people in Iraq. Following our release of the Afghan War Diaries, we thought we would try and pull together a broader coalition, not just involving print, but one that had the emotionality and impact of TV, journalism, and extra research from other groups. So we structured a collaboration between The Guardian, Spiegel, New York Times, our 3 previous print partners, and new groups, the Bureau for Investigative Journalism, the Iraq Body Count, whose knowledge of deaths in Iraq is unsurpassed, SVT, the Swedish television, Al Jazeera, Channel 4, BBC Radio, and I'm sure I've missed some others. Yes, Le Monde. That collaboration seems to have worked. And we will see over the next few days what's to be made of it. But so far, we can see a fairly strong response. We have seen, as of 3 a.m. This morning, 1,500 articles according to Google News, and of course, all around the world, we can see the result. We make a promise to our sources, who go through incredible risks sometimes to get us material, that we will do justice to their efforts and get them the maximum political impact possible. And while I'm not sure that we have achieved the maximum possible, I think we're getting pretty close. And with that, I'll introduce you now to Kristen.
Thank you. When WikiLeaks announced the release of the Afghan War Diary on July 26th,
The organization was condemned by the Pentagon for releasing material that was described as sensitive and harmful both to Afghanis and the troops in the country. Those overblown statements were echoed in most of the media without any criticism or critical question. 3 months have passed now, and there have been no reports of any harm in relation to the release of the Afghan War Diary. This has even been acknowledged by the Pentagon. Last week, some news organizations obtained a copy of a letter sent by U.S. Secretary of Defense Robert Gates to the head of the Senate Armed Services Committee on August 16. This was about the same time that Gates and Pentagon spokesperson were sending out strongly worded statements aimed at WikiLeaks. In Gates' letter, however, it is acknowledged that the Afghan documents had not revealed any, quote, sensitive intelligence sources or methods, unquote. Last week, a top NATO official reiterated in a statement to the press that he had not seen any harm as a result of the release. The contrast between the letter, the quote by the NATO official, and the hyped statements by the Pentagon spokesperson.
Earlier today, the website WikiLeaks released nearly 400,000 classified military documents on the Iraq War. They reportedly revealed details concerning thousands of previously unreported civilian deaths and torture against detainees by Iraqi authorities. Its founder was among a panel who spoke at a news conference in London to talk about his group's findings. This is an hour and 15 minutes.
For investigative journalism at City University, and I'll be attempting to moderate this morning. The press conference, as you know, is dedicated to the release of the Iraq War, and these releases are based on 4 that were received and published by WikiLeaks. You will have seen the print, of course, and television coverage this morning. Those speaking this morning are Julian Assange, the editor of WikiLeaks, which he founded in 2006. WikiLeaks has won a number of awards, including the Index on Censorship's 2008 Economist New Media Award, and an award of distinction from the Prix Arts Electronica. In June 2009, WikiLeaks and Julian Assange won Amnesty International's UK Media Award, and in July this year, he won the Sam Adams Award for Integrity. He's joined by Kristen Hofnesen, who became actively involved with WikiLeaks on the Collateral Murder video earlier this year, and has traveled to Baghdad on a fact-finding mission. He has 20 years' experience as an investigative journalist with Channel 2 News, which is a private broadcaster, and RUV, the Icelandic public state broadcaster. He's been awarded twice Iceland's highest journalism award. After WikiLeaks on the panel is John Sloboda. Since 2003, John has been coordinator of the Iraq Body Count Project, an ongoing human security project maintaining and updating the world's largest public database of violent civilian deaths since the 2003 invasion. He's a consultant and director of the Oxford Research Group's Recording Casualties in Armed Conflict program and chairs the International Advisory Group. He is emeritus professor of psychology at the University of Kiel and an honorary professor at the school.
Person should be a reminder that people should not accept condemning statements against WikiLeaks without question. In relation to the Afghan files, WikiLeaks withheld 1 in 6 reports, 15,000 in all, for line-by-line reviewing and redaction. That work is now finished, and the reports will be released soon. This time, WikiLeaks took a new approach to the redacting process. It used an electronic redaction method combined with tests done by groups of people. It is an innovative approach and has been perfected by a group of people contributing to the process. It can best be described as a reverse approach to redaction. At the outset, everything in all reports was deemed harmful and redacted until proven otherwise. From there on, words, phrases, locations, abbreviations, etc., were uncovered or unredacted step by step. The work in the passing weeks have therefore been focusing on minimizing the reduction. Along the way, batches of documents were taken out and tested by a group of qualified volunteers, and further tests were done on the 390,000 documents. We are confident now that the documents in the highly redacted form contain no information that could be harmful to individuals. Having said that, I would like to add that every system can contain flaws, but the likelihood of any flaw in our approach is surely minimal. The end result which we are presenting is still in a highly redacted cache of documents. Despite the over-reductions, the war log is easily readable and can be data mined for news stories and angles for those interested. We will also look into the possibility of providing news media and academics access to unredacted parts of the documents upon request. Furthermore, it needs to be emphasized